The early morning mist clung to the French countryside like a shroud of uncertainty, as Major General Robert Lee Bullard adjusted his field glasses and peered across the contested ground toward the German-held village of Cantigny. It was May 28, 1918, and the fate of American military credibility hung in the balance like morning dew, waiting for the sun's first rays. The small village, situated 70 miles north of Paris, had become more than just another dot on the Western Front's blood-soaked map. For the Germans, it represented a crucial observation post from which their artillery spotters could direct devastating fire upon Allied positions. For the French, it was a thorn in their side that needed removing, but for the Americans of the 1st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Big Red One, Cantigny represented something far more profound. Their first chance to prove that the United States Army could fight as an independent force. And when Bullard, a veteran of campaigns stretching from the American frontier to the Philippines, understood the weight of the moment pressing down upon his shoulders like an invisible yoke, the soldiers under his command were no longer the raw recruits who had arrived in France months earlier. They had been bloodied in quiet sectors, trained by battle-hardened French instructors, and tempered by the harsh realities of trench warfare. Yet this would be their first major offensive operation under American command, and the eyes of the world were watching. The village itself appeared deceptively peaceful in the dawn light, its stone buildings and church spire casting long shadows across the surrounding wheat fields. But Bullard knew better than to trust appearances. German machine gun nests had been carefully positioned throughout the settlement, their fields of fire interlocking to create a deadly web of steel. Artillery pieces hidden in the nearby woods could rain death upon any approaching force, while underground bunkers provided shelter for the defenders against the preliminary bombardment that would surely precede any assault. As referenced in the Army Historical Foundation's comprehensive analysis of the battle, the 28th Infantry Regiment had been selected to spearhead the attack, supported by elements of the 18th Infantry Regiment. Colonel Hanson Eli, commanding the 28th, had spent weeks studying aerial photographs and intelligence reports, mapping every German position with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. The American Expeditionary Force, under the overall command of General John Joseph Pershing, had faced mounting pressure from both French and British allies to commit their forces to the Western Front. The German spring offensive had begun in March, pushing Allied forces back across hard-won ground and threatening to break the stalemate that had characterized the war. For nearly 4 years, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch had personally requested that American units be used to plug gaps in the line, but Pershing had insisted that his forces fight as a cohesive unit under American command, rather than being parceled out as replacements for exhausted Allied formations. Cantigny represented a compromise between these competing visions. The 1st Division would operate under the tactical control of the French 10th Corps, but the attack itself would be planned and executed by American officers using American methods. It was a test not just of American fighting ability, but of American military leadership and organizational capability. The preparation for the assault on Cantigny had begun weeks earlier, with a level of meticulous planning that would have impressed even the most experienced German staff officers. Major General Bullard had assembled his regimental commanders in a converted farmhouse behind the lines, spreading detailed maps across a rough wooden table while oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls. Colonel Hanson Edward Eli, commanding the 28th Infantry Regiment, was a West Point graduate whose calm demeanor concealed the tactical acumen of a natural warrior. His regiment would bear the brunt of the fighting, advancing in 3 waves across approximately 800 yards of open ground before reaching the German trenches that surrounded Cantigny. The first wave would consist of 4 companies advancing in extended order, their rifle-armed doughboys supported by automatic rifle teams and hand grenade sections. Supporting Ellie's advance would be an unprecedented concentration of artillery firepower. French 75mm guns, renowned for their rapid rate of fire and accuracy, had been positioned in carefully concealed batteries throughout the sector. Heavy howitzers would target the German artillery positions identified by aerial reconnaissance, while field guns would lay down a creeping barrage just ahead of the advancing infantry. The coordination required between the various artillery units and the attacking forces represented a complex ballet of destruction that demanded split-second timing. The logistics of the operation were equally challenging. Ammunition, medical supplies, communication equipment, and reserve forces all had to be positioned within striking distance of the objective. while remaining hidden from German observers. Supply columns moved only at night, their vehicles traveling with dimmed headlights along roads that had been carefully marked with white tape to prevent units from becoming lost in the darkness. Captain George Marshall, serving as operations officer for the 1st Division, had personally supervised the construction of detailed sand table models of Cantigny and its surrounding terrain. These three-dimensional representations allowed company commanders to familiarize their subordinates with every building, trench, and potential obstacle they might encounter during the assault. Each platoon leader could point to the exact building his men would need to clear, while machine gun teams practiced setting up their weapons in positions that would provide covering fire for the advancing riflemen. The intelligence picture painted by French aerial photographs and prisoner interrogations revealed that Cantigny was defended by elements of the German 18th Army under the command of General Oskar von Hutier. The defenders consisted primarily of veteran troops who had been rotated to this relatively quiet sector after participating in earlier phases of the German spring offensive. Their positions had been strengthened with concrete machine gun emplacements, interconnected trenches, and underground shelters capable of protecting the garrison from all but the heaviest artillery. Bombardments, weather conditions added another variable to the already complex equation. The spring of 1918 had been unusually wet, turning the surrounding farmland into a morass of mud that would significantly slow any advancing force. Engineers had spent days improving roads and constructing corduroy paths across the worst sections of terrain, but the attacking infantry would still face the challenge of maintaining their formations while negotiating shell holes filled with stagnant water and stretches of ground churned into knee-deep muck by previous bombardments. Communication arrangements reflected the technological limitations of the era. While attempting to maintain command and control during the chaos of battle, field telephone lines had been buried as deeply as possible, but experience had shown that artillery fire inevitably severed these connections. At the most critical moments, signal rockets with predetermined meanings would be fired to indicate the progress of the attack, while carrier pigeons provided a backup method of transmitting urgent messages to division. Headquarters died exactly for 4:05 in the morning on May 28, 1918. The French artillery opened fire with a roar that shattered the pre-dawn stillness like the crack of divine judgment. From carefully concealed positions stretching across miles of front, nearly 400 guns of various calibers began their deadly symphony, sending shells screaming through the morning air toward German positions in and around Cantigny. The bombardment was not the random hurricane of steel that characterized so many Western Front offensives, but rather a carefully orchestrated demonstration of artillery science. French gunners, their skills honed by nearly 4 years of continuous warfare, methodically worked their way through a target list that had been compiled from weeks of aerial reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Heavy howitzers targeted known command posts and ammunition dumps, their high explosive shells creating mushroom clouds of smoke and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the air. Lieutenant Colonel George Rizal, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, watched the bombardment from his forward observation post. With a mixture of professional admiration and growing anxiety, his men were scheduled to begin their advance in exactly 1 hour, and the success of their mission depended largely on the effectiveness of this preliminary fire. Through his field glasses, he could see German signal rockets rising from various points around Cantigny, indicating that the defenders were calling for counter-battery fire against the French gun positions. The German response was not long in coming. Within minutes of the Allied bombardment beginning, enemy artillery began falling among the American assembly areas. Shells from German 7-7 millimeter guns and heavier howitzers created geysers of mud and shrapnel throughout the sector, forcing the waiting infantry to take cover in hastily dug trenches and shell holes. The accuracy of the German fire suggested that their observers had been watching American preparations for days, carefully plotting the locations of supply dumps and troop concentrations. Private William Thompson of Company B, 28th Infantry Regiment, pressed himself against the forward wall of a communication trench as German shells exploded with monotonous regularity in the area behind him. The 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa had enlisted the previous summer with dreams of adventure and glory, but the reality of modern warfare bore little resemblance to the romantic notions that had filled his imagination. The continuous thunder of artillery fire made conversation impossible, while the acrid smell of high explosives mixed with the stench of mud and human waste to create an atmosphere that seemed to assault every sense simultaneously. As documented in the 1st Division Museum's detailed account of the battle, the German defenders had positioned their machine guns with mathematical precision to create interlocking fields of fire across the approaches to Cantigny. Each gun crew had been provided with detailed range cards showing the exact distances to various landmarks, allowing them to deliver accurate fire even through smoke and dust. The weapons themselves were the feared WWII, capable of firing over 500 rounds per minute, with devastating effect against attacking infantry. Company commanders made final adjustments to their assault plans as the bombardment continued, studying aerial photographs that had been updated as recently as the previous evening. The German trench system around Cantigny consisted of 3 main lines, connected by communication trenches that would allow defenders to shift reinforcements quickly to threatened sectors. Barbed wire obstacles had been placed not just in front of the trenches, but also between them, creating multiple barriers that would channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The psychological impact of the artillery duel was perhaps as important as its physical effects. For the American soldiers preparing to make their first major assault, the overwhelming noise and violence of the bombardment served as both an encouragement and a warning. The tremendous firepower being unleashed on their behalf demonstrated that their commanders were taking every possible step to ensure the success of the operation, but it also provided a vivid preview of what they themselves would face once they left the relative safety of their trenches. Medical personnel had established aid stations at carefully selected locations behind the front lines, their Red Cross flags providing the only splash of color in a landscape dominated by browns and grays. Stretcher bearers had been organized into teams and provided with detailed maps showing the quickest routes back to the main dressing stations, while field surgeons prepared their instruments for what promised to be a busy day. At precisely 5:45 in the morning, the French artillery shifted their fire from the German front lines to targets deeper in the enemy rear, signaling the beginning of the infantry assault along the front of approximately 2,000 yards. The men of the 28th Infantry Regiment rose from their trenches and began their advance across the shell-torn ground toward Cantigny. The first wave consisted of 4 companies advancing in extended order, their riflemen spaced at 5-yard intervals to minimize casualties from machine gun fire and artillery bursts. Each soldier carried his Springfield rifle with fixed bayonet, 200 rounds of ammunition for hand grenades, and a 3-day supply of rations. The weight of their equipment, combined with the muddy conditions underfoot, made rapid movement impossible. But Colonel Ely had planned for this contingency by starting his men forward several minutes before the artillery barrage lifted. Lieutenant Robert Anderson of Company A led his platoon across a wheat field that had been transformed into a moonscape of overlapping shell craters. The young officer, a recent graduate of the Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, found himself experiencing the peculiar time distortion that affects men under extreme stress. Seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, while the 200 yards to the German wire appeared to expand before his eyes like an impossible chasm. The German machine guns opened fire almost immediately, their distinctive hammering sound cutting through the diminishing roar of the artillery bombardment. Streams of tracer bullets created deadly patterns of light across the battlefield, while the heavier bullets from the WWII began to take their toll. Among the advancing Americans, Private Thompson, the Iowa farm boy, saw the man next to him spin around and fall without a sound, blood already staining the mud where he landed. Supporting the rifle companies were teams armed with the Chochet automatic rifle, a French-designed weapon that had been adopted by the American Expeditionary Force despite its notorious unreliability. These teams attempted to provide covering fire for the advancing riflemen, but the weapon's tendency to jam at critical moments meant that many positions had to be taken by rifle fire and hand grenades rather than the suppressive fire originally planned. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a regular Army veteran who had served on the Mexican border before the war, led his squad through a gap in the German wire that had been created by the preliminary bombardment. The Irish immigrant from Boston had seen combat before, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of the fire being directed at his small unit. Machine gun bullets cracked overhead with a sound like angry wasps, while rifle fire from German trenches added to the deadly symphony. The first German trench line was reached at approximately 6:15 in the morning. After 30 minutes of bitter fighting across open ground, American soldiers, their uniforms already torn and mud-stained, leaped down into the enemy positions with bayonets ready and grenades in hand. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in dozens of locations along the line as defenders who had survived the bombardment attempted to hold their positions against the attacking doughboys. Private First Class James Mueller, a German-American soldier from Milwaukee who spoke the enemy's language, found himself face-to-face with a German soldier of roughly his own age in a section of trench near the village outskirts. The brief conversation that followed, conducted in rapid German while both men gripped their rifles, represented one of the war's countless small human dramas played out against the larger backdrop of national conflict, according to detailed reports preserved in the Army Historical Foundation archives. The advance continued with grim determination despite mounting casualties. American soldiers, who had trained for months in the relatively static conditions of trench warfare, found themselves adapting to the fluid requirements of mobile combat. Squad leaders who had been killed or wounded were replaced by privates who assumed command responsibility without hesitation, while medics moved forward with the assault troops to provide immediate aid to the wounded. The village of Cantigny itself presented a complex tactical problem that could not be solved by artillery fire alone. Each building potentially contained German defenders who could engage American forces from multiple directions, while cellars and reinforced structures provided excellent defensive positions. Company commanders found themselves fighting a series of small unit actions rather than a single coordinated battle, as their platoons cleared buildings methodically while maintaining contact with adjacent units. By 7:30 in the morning, elements of the 28th Infantry Regiment had fought their way into the heart of Cantigny, transforming the quiet French village into a battlefield that resembled scenes from Dante's Inferno. American soldiers moved from house to house with the systematic efficiency of experienced urban fighters, though most had never before engaged in combat more complex than training exercises in the pine forests of Georgia. The village church, its Gothic spire now pockmarked with shell holes and bullet scars, became the scene of particularly fierce fighting as German defenders attempted to use its stone construction and elevated position to their advantage. Lieutenant Colonel Rizal personally led a team of volunteers in an assault on the building, armed with rifle grenades and satchel charges that had been improvised from available explosives. The sound of gunfire echoing through the sacred space created an unsettling counterpoint to the morning hymns that had been sung there just days before. Captain Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president and commanding officer of Company B, found himself directing urban combat operations with an aplomb that would have made his famous father proud. The Harvard-educated officer had insisted on accompanying the first wave of the assault, despite his staff position, arguing that his men deserved to see their leaders sharing the same risks they faced. His presence in the forward positions provided a tremendous boost to morale, as soldiers who had heard stories of his father's charge up San Juan Hill drew inspiration from the Roosevelt family's continuing tradition of military service. The German defenders fought with the stubborn tenacity of veteran soldiers who understood that their positions were crucial to the overall defensive scheme. In this sector of the Western Front, many of the enemy troops encountered by the Americans were members of elite stormtrooper units that had been rotated to Cantigny after participating in the earlier phases of the spring offensive. These men possessed extensive experience in the fluid combat conditions that characterized modern warfare, and they made the Americans pay dearly for every building and street corner. Machine gun nests that had been carefully positioned in cellars and reinforced structures proved particularly difficult to eliminate. American soldiers found that rifle fire was largely ineffective against these positions, forcing them to rely on hand grenades and the occasional rifle grenade to neutralize the defenders. The process was slow and costly, with each strong point requiring a carefully coordinated assault that often resulted in casualties. Among the attacking force stopped Private Thompson, the Iowa farm boy who had somehow survived the initial advance across open ground, found himself crouched behind a stone wall while German bullets chipped fragments from the masonry just inches above his head. The young soldier had already expended most of his ammunition during the approach to the village, and his rifle had become so fouled with mud that he was uncertain whether it would fire reliably. The romantic notions of warfare that had filled his imagination during training had been completely replaced by a grim focus on immediate survival. Communication with higher headquarters became increasingly difficult as the battle progressed deeper into Cantigny. Field telephone lines that had been carefully installed during the preparatory phase had been severed by shell fire, while the noise and confusion of combat made effective use of signal rockets nearly impossible. Company commanders found themselves making tactical decisions based on incomplete information, relying on their training and professional judgment to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The systematic clearing of Cantigny required skills that had not been emphasized during training in the United States, forcing American soldiers to improvise techniques for urban combat on the battlefield itself. Squads learned to coordinate their movements with adjacent units to prevent fratricidal incidents, while maintaining sufficient dispersion to avoid presenting concentrated targets. For German artillery fire, the process was complicated by the presence of French civilians who had been unable to evacuate before the fighting began, adding another layer of complexity to an already challenging tactical situation. By 10:30 in the morning of May 28th, the American flag flew over the ruins of Cantigny's town hall. But Major General Bullard understood that the real test was yet to come. German doctrine emphasized immediate counterattacks to retake lost positions, and intelligence reports indicated that enemy reserves were already moving forward to challenge the American occupation of the village. The 1st Division had achieved its primary objective, but at a cost that sobered even experienced officers who had witnessed the carnage of previous Western Front battles. Casualty reports filtering back to division headquarters painted a grim picture of companies reduced to half strength and platoons commanded by sergeants whose officers had fallen during the assault. Medical personnel worked frantically to evacuate wounded soldiers to aid stations behind the lines, while ammunition resupply became an urgent priority for forces that had expended most of their rifle cartridges during the house-to-house fighting. Colonel Eli established his regimental command post in the basement of a partially destroyed building near the center of Cantigny, surrounding himself with maps, field telephones, and radio equipment that would allow him to coordinate the defense of his newly won positions. The stone walls provided some protection against shell fragments, but the colonel knew that German artillery observers were probably already adjusting their fire based on the American positions they could observe throughout the village. The first German counterattack began at 11:15. Preceded by artillery bombardment that demonstrated the enemy's intimate knowledge of Cantigny's layout and defensive possibilities. High explosive shells systematically targeted every building that could provide cover for American defenders, while shrapnel rounds burst over the streets to catch soldiers moving between positions. The accuracy of the fire suggested that German observers had maintained their positions in nearby wooded areas. Despite the earlier Allied bombardment, Lieutenant Anderson, the young platoon leader who had survived the morning assault, found himself commanding the remnants of 2 companies that had been consolidated into a single defensive unit. His position anchored the left flank of the American perimeter, occupying a series of shell-damaged houses that overlooked the approaches to Cantigny. From the north, the 23-year-old officer had received his commission only 6 months earlier, but the morning's combat had provided him with more practical experience in small unit leadership than years of peacetime service could have offered. German assault troops advanced against the American positions with the systematic precision that characterized their army's tactical doctrine. Stormtrooper units, supported by machine gun teams and light artillery pieces that had been moved forward during the bombardment, attempted to infiltrate the American perimeter rather than launching frontal assaults against prepared positions. This approach proved more effective than direct attacks, forcing American defenders to maintain vigilance in all directions, rather than concentrating their fire against obvious avenues of approach. The fighting throughout the afternoon of May 20th took on a different character from the morning's assault, as both sides adapted to the urban environment and the tactical requirements of defensive combat. American soldiers learned to coordinate their fire with adjacent positions, creating interlocking fields of coverage that prevented German infiltration attempts from succeeding. The process required constant communication between squad leaders and company commanders, often conducted by runners who risked their lives crossing streets swept by machine gun fire, as documented in comprehensive after-action reports preserved by the 1st Division Museum. Ammunition resupply became a critical factor in determining the outcome of the defensive battle. German artillery fire had severed most of the roads leading into Cantigny, forcing American logistics personnel to organize carrying parties that moved supplies forward on foot through communication, trenches, and shell holes. Each trip required tremendous courage for men who faced constant exposure to enemy fire, while the quantities of ammunition that could be transported by this method were barely sufficient to meet the demands of continuous combat. Private Thompson, now a veteran of nearly 8 hours of continuous fighting, found himself sharing a shell hole with 3 other soldiers whose units had become intermingled. During the confused urban combat, the Iowa farm boy had discovered reserves of courage and determination that he never knew he possessed. But the constant strain of battle was beginning to take its toll on men who had been awake for nearly 24 hours. The final German counterattack against Cantigny began at 4:30 in the afternoon of May 28th, as lengthening shadows provided some concealment for assault troops who had spent hours maneuvering into position around the village perimeter. This effort represented the most serious challenge to American control of the objective, as German commanders committed their best remaining reserves in an attempt to restore their defensive line before nightfall. Major General Bullard observed the battle from his forward command post, watching through field glasses as green signal rockets indicated the positions of his various units throughout Cantigny. The reports reaching him painted a picture of desperate fighting at close quarters, with American soldiers holding their positions through sheer determination. Despite mounting casualties and dwindling ammunition supplies, the general understood that the outcome of this single battle would have implications far beyond the tactical situation in this quiet sector of the Western Front. German stormtroopers, their uniforms still bearing the mud of previous battles, advanced through the rubble-strewn streets with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who had perfected urban combat techniques during months of offensive operations. These men represented the elite of the German army, veterans of successful assaults against British and French positions, who possessed an intimate understanding of the tactical requirements for seizing defended objectives. Their equipment included specialized weapons designed for close-quarters combat, while their training emphasized small unit tactics and individual initiative. The decisive moment came when German assault troops succeeded in penetrating the American perimeter at 2 locations simultaneously, threatening to split the defenders into isolated groups that could be defeated in detail. Lieutenant Anderson, commanding his composite force from a position near the village church, realized that immediate action was required to prevent the collapse of the entire defensive line. The young officer gathered every available soldier in his immediate vicinity and launched a counterattack that succeeded in sealing the breach, though at tremendous cost to his already depleted unit. Captain Roosevelt, despite having been wounded earlier in the day, continued to move between defensive positions throughout Cantigny, encouraging his men and coordinating their resistance against the German assault. The son of the former president had already demonstrated the family tradition of personal courage under fire, but his actions during the final hours of the battle elevated him to legendary status. Among the soldiers of the 1st Division, his presence at critical points in the defensive line provided a rallying point for Americans who were fighting beyond the limits of normal human endurance. The German attack began to falter as daylight faded, with assault troops finding themselves isolated in a hostile urban environment where every building potentially contained American defenders. The systematic approach that had characterized earlier German operations broke down into a series of uncoordinated local actions as communication between units became impossible, and individual squad leaders found themselves making tactical decisions without guidance from higher command. By 6:30 in the evening, German forces were withdrawing from their advanced positions around Cantigny, leaving behind equipment and wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated under fire. The American defense had succeeded, but as referenced in detailed casualty reports preserved by military historians, the cost had been enormous. Over 800 American soldiers had been killed or wounded during the day's fighting, representing nearly 20% of the attacking force. The battle for Cantigny officially ended at sunset on May 28, 1918, when the last German artillery rounds fell silent and patrols confirmed that enemy forces had withdrawn to defensive positions beyond effective range of American small arms fire. The stars and stripes continued to fly over the captured village, but the price of victory had been measured in American bloodshed on foreign soil for principles that many of the participants only dimly understood. Private Thompson, one of the survivors of Company B, found himself helping to carry wounded comrades to the aid station that had been established in Cantigny's damaged church. The Iowa farm boy had been transformed by combat into a veteran soldier whose eyes reflected experiences that no amount of training could have provided. The romantic notions of warfare that had filled his imagination during the journey to France had been completely replaced by a grim understanding of modern combat's true nature. The victory at Cantigny represented more than the capture of a single French village. It demonstrated that American forces could fight effectively as an independent command and achieve tactical success against veteran German troops. The battle established the credibility of the American Expeditionary Force and validated General Pershing's insistence that United States Army units should operate under American leadership, rather than being dispersed among allied formations. Major General Bullard's report to higher headquarters concluded with words that would resonate through American military history. The 1st Division has proven that American soldiers can fight and win against the best troops that Germany can put in the field. The Battle of Cantigny had ended, but its significance would extend far beyond the muddy fields and shell-torn buildings, where so many brave men had given their lives for their country's honor.